Okay, are you actually all seeing the large inclusive design for ASI partnership? Is that showing up?
Yep, you have
All
it.
right, sounds good. Always nerve-wracking when you share the screen, in my opinion. But yeah, thanks so much for having me here today. I think my role in the Division of Extension and the university as a whole is thinking about equal access for folks with disabilities and what are reasonable accommodations that can be put into place for that equal access. I think, to Janine's point, Extension and a lot of our partners around the state are working so well and so closely with such a wide variety of folks that some things that I, talk about or think people need to be thinking about are already being done because that's how we reach out and we serve folks. But today's hope is to actually take a little bit of a deeper dive into disability and also sort of toss out some ideas and considerations around accessibility and or accommodations for folks with disabilities who might be participating in your different events, trainings, volunteer opportunities. So I will advance the slide here, I think. All right. So as we're talking about this, the four big things that I want to go over today is actually defining disability, sharing a little bit more about taglines, actually sharing some of those considerations for specific populations of disability and disability experiences, and then briefly touch on accommodations. You are welcome to chat, ask questions as we go along. And I think we'll have a little bit of time for questions at the very end after Samantha speaks as well. So welcome to participate as you see fit as we go along. So, one of the key part of thinking about why are we talking about this, about accessibility and inclusive practices, is we know that we can reach a broader audience when we're thinking about these things on the front end. We also know that there are certain populations of people that have been underserved, underrepresented, excluded. And so by taking a few steps proactively, the idea is that we're reaching those folks as well. By being inclusive and putting some things in practice around accessibility, ideally we're creating a safe and positive learning environment for folks to participate and take knowledge and information out and disseminate it even more broadly. It also signals support and welcome. So even if people don't necessarily need accommodations, but maybe they know somebody who has a disability or things of that nature, it's signaling to other people like, okay, there's been some thought, there's been consideration. I want to be a part of, I want to share, I want to talk more about the programming that's available for volunteers around the state in a variety of ways. It also gives a sense of belonging, particularly for there are certain populations of disability that I think feel excluded more so than others, or who are looking for a greater sense of purpose, and volunteer opportunities are oftentimes a really great way to increase that sense of belonging. The other aspect is that being proactive and considering inclusive practices, it really reduces the onus placed on disabled participants or volunteers. Accommodations are great. They're here to level the playing field, and they still require a little extra work from people who are oftentimes already doing a little extra work for access and within their daily life. So anytime that we can reduce that onus and make things a bit smoother or easier, it's always a good idea. So I want to, and I always do start out with a definition of disability because because I think it's really important to highlight that. The Division of Extension and other programs that receive federal funding all fall under the Americans with Disabilities Act and their requirements to provide equal access and to not discriminate on the basis of disability. So if we're not going to discriminate on the basis of disability, it's a pretty good practice to then be aware of what might be considered a disability. I think one of the key things here on the left hand of the screen is that disability, like all abilities, exists on a continuum. And I'm certainly not necessarily comparing, you know, a temporary disability to a lifelong permanent disability, but I think it's also fair to highlight that because that is oftentimes some of the ways that participants are showing up to volunteers or voluntary programs or trainings is that there might be a temporary disability, or maybe there's a long-term disability, but it flares up. And today, on the day of this training, is a day where their rheumatoid arthritis is really, really high, but they didn't want to miss this really great opportunity because they're passionate about Wisconsin's waterways, right? I think part of that continuum and how I often think about disability is that it's not necessarily on the person or, you know, sort of the person's quote unquote fault. Oftentimes the environment and society's expectations play a relatively big role in creating some of those barriers. Now that gets really interesting in the work that you do because it's literally the environment and the natural surroundings that create the barriers. And we know that those are ways that we can't, it's not reasonable to change mother nature or some of the different pathways. So we'll talk a little bit more about what's reasonable and what's not as well. The other thing about disability to know is that I think sometimes people qualify or would be considered to be a person with a disability, but they certainly don't identify as such. I think sometimes it's, you know, it's just, this is my life and I never thought of it as being a disability or being disabling. But from the federal, the federal definition, it very well might be. In related to that, I also think there are plenty of people who don't recognize or consider that maybe they could ask for accommodations, and also might not consider that what they're asking for as an accommodation. It's just something I need to participate. So we use the language, or I use the language around accommodations and reasonable accommodations and equal access, but some folks might not even think about what they're asking for as such. It's just what they need, so they're going to ask for it. In regards to that definition of disability, the Americans with Disabilities Act looks at disability as a substantial limitation in a major life activity. I've included a list of a few different major life activities. This is not extensive or cover all of them, but just as an example, learning, concentrating, reading, bodily functions. So that includes bodily systems. So your immune system, respiratory system, different things of that nature. If there are substantial limitations in regards to that, it can be regarded as a disability. Actually, diabetes is one of those health conditions that technically would be considered a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act, because there's a system in the body that is not functioning the way that is intended to. Breathing, sitting, standing, or walking, seeing or hearing. And we're really going to be focusing on those last three bullet points there because these are the areas that I think we often think about accessibility. And I think in the non-apparent limitations around learning, concentrating, reading, that's kind of what is done so naturally because you all are working so closely with a variety of folks. So we're going to really focus in on on those apparent disabilities around mobility, vision, and hearing in particular today. So one of the first and foremost things, if you leave with nothing else here today, my big hope is that you leave here knowing that somewhere in your event, flyer, website, whatever it might be, is that you use some sort of tagline. A tagline is a way that lets participants know what accessibility is offered and how to make accommodation request. The Division of Extension does offer different equal opportunity statements that you can copy and paste. I actually meant to link it here, so I apologize. I missed that detail. And those statements are really helpful through the Office of Access and Inclusion and Compliance. They're actually already translated into a few different, into Hmong and Spanish as well. And those are really helpful to utilize. But I think that in reality, that's a lot of language to put on a flyer. So one of the key ways that you can think about taglines is actually just notifying of expectations, right? So this training will take place on the shorelines of this lake. There will be a fair amount of walking and getting into the water. Please consider that as you register for this event. And if you want to talk about some possible considerations, modifications, or accommodations, please reach out to the director of this event. So the key part of there is that you're kind of giving people an idea of like what they can be prepping for or expecting, and allowing themselves to know themselves like, okay, yes, this would be a good fit, or this might be a little bit harder for me to participate in, but I think I can make it happen. Let me reach out to the coordinator of this event and see what we can put into place. And so the last bullet point there is just a little example of how you might actually use a tagline without it totally being connected to disability, or also reaching that audience who might be experiencing some of those barriers or limitations without necessarily identifying as having a disability. So, for example, this event requires walking and wading in water. Please contact whoever it might be at whatever phone number and or email. I would recommend both, actually, if that level of activity will be challenging. We may be able to provide an alternative solution, modification, or accommodations. And I put the may there because accommodations do need to be reasonable. What that means is that they can't fundamentally alter some aspect of the training or the location, and they have to be not burdensome. So, if we're talking about being out in, a nature preserve or wetlands or protected wetlands, right? Like, we're definitely not altering those particular environments because they're protected, and because if we were to alter them, it would be likely a boatload of money, right? So the expectation is not that we're necessarily changing all of the things that we do or the places that we're doing, but maybe there's a few other things that we can consider to be ready for a variety of folks who might show up. Any questions on taglines? All right. So one of the other things related to that tagline is prior to the event, announcing it as soon as you possibly can. Certainly posting that announcement to your website, even if you're sending it in a newsletter or an email or the postal service. Oftentimes the website can be a little bit more accessible because people can enlarge text, or they can refer back to it. It's always there, things of that nature. If you're announcing with a PDF attachment, so oftentimes I'll see this in my work as somebody will say, we're hosting this event, please see the attachment for more information. The reality is that sometimes that attachment might not be accessible for folks who have low vision. It might also not be accessible for sort of computers that folks have, or if they're using their cell phone in particular. So if you are sending or inviting folks and referring to a PDF attachment, copy that important information into the email. Or if you're posting it on social media, again, making sure that anything on a PDF or an image is also copied into an easily accessible text box. There's actually a really great example on the Natural Resources Institute's Facebook page recently from Upham Woods, where it's this very lovely flyer. It's got some images. It tells folks, you know, what they can expect, how to register, but all of that information is also in the actual post. So if somebody couldn't see or utilize the PDF that was in the Facebook post, it's there in text as well. So for the interest of time, I will just encourage you to take a look at that recent post. I think it was just from a day or two from Upham Woods as a great example of what that actually looks like. If you are putting out paper flyers at different locations around your communities, whether it's a bait shop or the Rotary Club or just, you know, the community center, we would encourage you to be really thoughtful about what those flyers look like around color contrast, font size, as well as simplicity. A lot of visual information can be overwhelming. The important information can get lost. So as much as it's really tempting to go with a big, bright, beautiful image, also be aware that sometimes those can be distracting and not accessible for folks. It can also be really helpful to use a QR code. So when people have smartphones, they can actually go right to the website, or using a shortened URL to get to that website so they can register, and certainly a phone number. Again, having two different ways to register, contact, or learn more can be really helpful. And again, you're going to want to include the tagline there. Also, prior to the event in general, is inform folks of locations of accessible parking, or even talking about, you know, sort of the location of where parking might happen and how far they might have to go to actually access the event or the training. Thank you, Janine, for putting the link directly into the chat. So because y'all do so many different things, I've tried to break these into a few different areas as well. So when you're doing indoor trainings, if you are working off of slides, doing your best to make sure that slides are accessible. So using very clean slides, not necessarily having a lot of content or decorative images, using a font size of at least 18 or more. If you're referring to captions, videos, making sure that those are captioned. You know, I know that there's been partnerships where Extension has supported and made sure that those captions are utilized for our public-facing YouTube page. Super important aspect, and also a federal guideline for accessibility for any public-facing media that is connected with the Extension as well. This one, I think this next bullet point about alternative text or alt text for images gets to be really important, because based on what I understand about some of the trainings and work that you're doing, you have to use a lot of images. So really describing those images carefully, or even picking out specific areas or things to focus on when you are describing some of those images as well. We also recommend that you share training materials in advance, so people can kind of prep their brains. Maybe they can zoom in a little bit. They can have questions ready to go. We do encourage, obviously, that you practice some presentations so that the language is feeling pretty comfortable, that you feel pretty comfortable describing the images on the slides. read all of the text on slides. If you are doing a training with a variety of folks in a panel, please identify each speaker as you go along. And we also think it's a great idea to create alternative ways for questions to be answered, whether it's small group, pieces of paper on a table that people can write those questions down, or if people are coming in with their iPads to different trainings, you know, creating a Google Doc or something like that to ask those questions. I am just going to pause there. Megan asked, where do maps rank in providing some of that information about locations, walking, terrain, etc.? That's a really great question. As far as accessibility, maps are not always incredibly accessible for somebody who has low vision, but also the visual information of, you know, here's where it exists on a road. That's something that people are relatively used to doing. So, you know, I think in regards to maps, you can certainly use them, but again, I would also have some of that information in print as well. That way, you're reaching multiple users as well. So I don't know if that's a very clear answer to you, but maps can be really great. Google Maps, if people are working off of that, has some accessibility. But again, if we're working off of just a print map, it might not be accessible for somebody with low vision or, you know, just difficulty actually accessing that. I'm also thinking about times where I've been in the woods and, like, you know, following a map and like the "you are here" is like scratched out and smooth, and you can actually no longer tell where you are. So also being thoughtful about, is there something that somebody can refer back to know where they're going or what it might be like. When you're out in the field, I think this is where it gets really, really tricky in many cases. And when I think about field trainings or being out doing events, different volunteers, gathering samples of things like that, you're not necessarily going to be able to be handing out a ton of pieces of paper, but if you can share any sort of documentation material or training materials prior, that's great. Again, you're still going to be thinking about that accessibility piece and creating documents. That's a whole nother session. And again, if folks are coming with their personal devices and they like to refer back to them using QR codes or things like that, so people can pull that up when they're out and about. Other things to consider is laminating key information in a larger font so it can be referred back to, that it can have some water spilled in on it. And then in regards to the variety of products, what I mean by that is having a few different options, right? So whether it is a shorter rake handle or a wider rake handle, you know, the different reaches can sometimes provide more accessibility. I will say pool noodles can be a really great way to make some adaptations on the fly, whether it is about making something a little bit softer to grip or a little bit thicker so that there's not as much grip strength needed. I also think about the option of oh, hold on. I had a whole list in my head about what I was going to share there, and it's blanking. Oh, even if you're thinking about taking samples, right? So does one of those products have a handle that might be easier to grip? Or if somebody is an amputee where, you know, the handle is going to be really important, but maybe for somebody else, it's going to be really important for a container for samples to not have a grip, and so that it's actually utilized for both hands because of hand strength or arm strength. So that's what I mean by having a variety of products available. Likewise, just thinking about the physical nature of a lot of the work that you're doing, any way that you can reduce some of that, some of the strain on the body, again, whether it's disability or age, or, you know, coming off of surgery, having some availability of something soft to kneel on, providing a few pads. That would be something that you would notify folks of, you know, ahead of time, like kneeling pads will be available. Also thinking about creating or working with somebody else in your community who can maybe donate some supplies or time to actually make some portable handrails. So thinking about getting up off of the ground, you know, from a kneeling position, or even if it's about getting off of a seated position within a boat or something like that. So the key part of that is actually just considering how an activity could be done alternatively. So is there another way to do this, right? Like there's a specific way to reach the standards for testing or sampling, but is there another way that we can be tossing something out into the water, bringing something back in? And that's why having taglines is really helpful. If somebody's aware of that, they can reach out and say, hey, I'm not going to, I have limited range of motion, or I need to be sitting a fair amount. Would it be possible if I have this job, or can I bring my own equipment, or something along those lines, so they can actually feel like, you know, that there's going to be a solution. Or that you're sort of prepped for, okay, what would it be like if somebody has limited strength or range of motion? Again, we know that there are going to be some environments where it's not reasonable or possible to accommodate, you know, full access, but maybe there is an alternative way to access things. So just kind of putting on your creative helmet and thinking about what would it be like if somebody couldn't see or hear or move as easily or as functionally as I might be able to, or as this was designed. I think another easy little thing to consider, that it's a very tiny thing, you might already be doing it, but to invite the use of camp chairs. So people can sit and rest when you're training, or that they can take a break from what is being done as well. And then if you are doing field work where you're measuring, if it's possible to bring some of that material or samples back to a space, just encouraging you to utilize accessible picnic tables. Again, maybe not necessarily for a wheelchair user, but accessible picnic tables also have accessibility built in for range of motion, or for different heights to be used, instead of sort of squatting down low, or wedging ourselves into an odd angle on the seat. So also just being thoughtful about where else could I be doing this, that might be a little supportive. There's a lot of information that I still have to share, would love to share, but I also know that I have pretty limited time here today. So I think what would be great to do is, I have shared this via Google, that Google form, Janine, so you're welcome to pass that on. But I do have different areas to go through for each of the mobility, vision, and hearing areas of populations. So I'm just going to put it back there and say, what do we want to do here? I know that we also have Samantha as well, so I want to honor time.
Yeah, that's great that you put it in the box or the Google folder that I made already. Oh, good, because I'll definitely be making a PDF of it and putting it into one of the places we share our materials. Maybe we'll see what questions come up after Sam, and his slides are appropriate to answer the questions. We can pop them up then too. So if you just keep it handy,
sure,
that'd be great. Thanks for keeping an eye on the time. Sam, yeah. Are you ready so we can swap around here? So many of you know Sam Lammers. Oh, you know what? I don't see her on here. Samantha, did we lose you? Uh-oh. You may have more time, Heather. Co-rangers Matt and Amanda. Have either of you seen Sam show up? Let me check my email and see if she sent me anything.
I don't. Sam, I feel like I did. Sam Coyan.
Yeah,
a
I
while
thought
ago, but
no, Lammers. I thought I saw
no,
it
I've not seen
earlier.
her.
Okay. I'll try texting her. Heather, if you want to keep going, go for it. And I'll just give you a heads up if Sam suddenly gets here. Maybe she's having internet problems.
All right, that's what we'll do then. So again, sort of thinking about, we know that you're active and you're doing a lot of your trainings and events all over, but just some considerations in regards to mobility is being, considered the routes between locations on site, right? Like, how close can somebody park before they need to walk down to, the river access or the lake access point? When you're in the field, again, sort of considering, like, is there a place that people could sit or rest or be in the shade? Are there other options? So could I do this training in a different location that actually has a little bit more accessibility, or, has a few paved paths around the area? Again, not always possible, and that's okay, but it's sort of thinking about, is there an alternative way that might invite more folks to participate or learn? Thinking about that vehicle access again, is there accessible parking? How close can vehicles get? Are you in a space where UTVs could be utilized on trails and getting to particular water areas? One of the great resources that Wisconsin has is Accessibility Wisconsin, which has all-terrain wheelchairs. And it might not necessarily be somebody who uses a wheelchair all of the time, but maybe using that wheelchair through accessibility allows them to actually get into the water or get closer to where the training is. So also thinking about that, it could be utilized that way. A question mark is, can you use bikes? There are times where mobility is certainly impacted, but being on a bike where there's not pressure or weight could be helpful. So what would it be like to allow somebody to bike to a location or things of that nature? Just thinking about the variety of waterways that work might be being done on or trainings might be happening on. Again, thinking if there is a concrete boat launch available, sometimes that can just make things a little bit more accessible to get up and down, or just a little bit of a smoother surface versus different rock areas. And then again, I think just sort of inviting folks to say, hey, if you have walking poles, please bring them for balance or additional support. And again, if you're working closely with a different community provider or partner, seeing if somebody can donate and that you actually have some walking poles around as well.
Heather, I just found out Samantha had a bit of a medical emergency, so she's not going to make it. So you just go ahead and use all the time you need, and then we'll have discussion.
Well, I hope everything's okay.
Yeah,
it's always nerve-wracking.
It's that girl. Yeah, she's got a little problem.
Okay, well, we'll see if we can cover. And I was so looking forward because I was wondering what it actually looks like in practice, right? Because I'll be honest, I'm sitting here somewhat in a bubble and thinking about what it might look like. And so, geez, it would have, I was so interested to hearing what this might actually look like, but also perhaps she'll be able to speak to this at some point later on as well.
Yeah, and we have we have this Lakes and Rivers call on Tuesday mornings, the first Tuesday morning of every month, and maybe she'll be able to do her part of the presentation during that. I think January is the next one that has the AIS topic, and I'll just keep it in my mind to invite you to join us for that.
Yeah, because I'd love to hear it. Because I think while we're thinking specifically about aquatic invasive species here, right? Like what is being done in Samantha's location is also probably transferable amongst other institutes within the Division of Extension as well. So I would love to hear that. Keeping in line with thinking about mobility is also thinking about accessibility on water. I think this is one of those really unique places, again, where it can be there can be a lot of tricky situations and barriers in that both mobility as well as strength wise. So again, just thinking, I was recently up on the Mondo flowage and we were camping there, and some of the campsites have docks, which were great for fishing and great for my in-laws to be able to easily access the water via their canoes, whereas other sites were just, there were no docks, right? And so getting onto the water and then into your, the boat or the kayak, that just requires a lot more balance, a lot more strength. So again, just thinking about, okay, is there a dock that I can utilize, you know, as well? That's going to ease up some access concerns for some folks. Thinking about actually being in the water, getting rid of some invasive species. You know, I don't actually know what this would be like in practice, but thinking about, you know, our additional flotation devices, or sort of like the I call them aqua belts. Would that help sort of release some of the weight that people have, or maybe they can, you know, take off some of those flotation devices while they're actually doing work and in the water, but then put them back on to sort of reduce some of the weight or the difficulties with balance when they're actually moving within the water. There are also different things that can be made sort of via PVC pipe that can help with balance as well. So again, thinking about just the terrain and how easy it is to lose your balance within the water, thinking about, you know, can we actually make a few things you know, that might help with balance as well. And again, these might not be perfect solutions, but if they make things just a little bit easier and people feel welcomed, you know, it's going to keep them coming back and continuing to spread the message, which is, I think, probably one of the key elements of the work that you're doing, is continuing to have people know and talk about what needs to be done to prevent the spread. If you're using boats, I mean, I would say that pontoons are a boat that are relatively accessible. So if there's access to a pontoon, fantastic. Making sure that if you are using that there's a ramp, whether you're using a wheelchair or not. Having a ramp onto a boat certainly can, again, help with balance, strength, mobility issues as well. Adding handrails where you can. Again, these might be permanent, they might not be. They may be something that you can build or a partner can build. There may be a grant that you can apply for to add handrails to boats or docks as well. Thinking about adding some skid pads on a ramp and or the boat, thinking about, again, that balance, the instability that can come with wet boats and wet flooring. So anything that can help stabilize in that aspect. If there are wheelchair users and they're able to you know, participate with some accommodations, also thinking about whether or not they or you can purchase additional tie downs or tension knobs to then keep a wheelchair stable and safe while on a boat. Adaptive canoes and kayaks, again, inviting folks, you know, to bring some of their own adaptive equipment could be a great way to do that. There is, I believe, a place out of Michigan that does a lot of adaptive sort of additions onto kayaks. So there's paddle holders, they're called Versa paddles. So moving one moves the others, and it's just right in front of the user on the kayak. Outriggers can really help with that balance. And then also just thinking about, great, you can get into the kayak and the boat, but you know, having some carts available to help somebody get down to the water with their kayak. Another resource is Fishing Has No Boundaries. We have this a few different places in Wisconsin. And while they're focused particularly on adaptive fishing equipment, I also thought they would probably be a decent resource to talk about adaptive equipment for gathering samples or also getting on the water as well. So again, there's a few different chapters throughout Wisconsin that I thought would be worth sharing as well. Health considerations. I think this is probably true for most folks, but also if there is an additional bodily function impacted, considering where accessible bathrooms are, how close are you to those? I think a lot of porta johns, porta pits or just pits in general are, I've noticed a lot more of those are accessible, which is great. Sharing the location of water fountain, or actually bringing potable water. You know, hydration can be key for managing a fair amount of health conditions. Again, thinking about how do we get from one place to the next, right? Maybe some folks walk from one location to the next, but maybe somebody can, again, bike or drive or use a UTV to get to the other location. Repeating, considering seating options and spots for breaks. And then also thinking if you have somebody monitoring actual lake shores, is also just offering a pop-up sun shelter, or encouraging them to bring their own. Again, sort of that sun protection. There's a fair amount of medications that have light sensitivity or sun sensitivity, and certainly managing heat can be hugely helpful for a fair amount of health conditions as well. Considerations for folks with low vision, or just vision loss of some sort. Again, practices that are going to benefit everybody is describing the images. I think particularly, my guess is that most of you are already doing this when you're actually showing the species that is a problem or the species that you're hoping to support. But you know, I think really getting into the details and maybe even offering a few different ways to think about it or compare parts of that species that might jump out or be able to more easily be identified for some folks with low vision. Being aware of color contrast. So when you're in a training and you're, you know, showing a map of Wisconsin and where a species is particularly problematic, not only do you want to like actually name the county or the location, but also describe, right, the color and what it compares like to other counties or things like that. So you know, I think I saw a map recently where, you know, everything else was white and it was just the problematic areas were just the one color, right? So it didn't necessarily go into great detail, but it really popped out like, these are the 6 counties where this species is really showing up. So you can also simplify in that way as well. I kind of talked about using the multiple comparisons or examples for species identification. Again, we're just hoping that something is going to click and be a little bit more readily identifiable. Using alternative text on documents. Again, you're describing the images, you're showing what that image is, you're talking about what that image means. I'd encourage you to also get getting used to doing this practice on social media as well. And I think there's a great chat here. A child who is just diagnosed with dyslexia. And again, it makes you think, right, about, okay, what is this like if reading comprehension is a challenge, or there's just so much information coming at me that it's hard to track, or I've never seen that word. What does it mean? So I think that's a great example of thinking about using common symbols and making sure that those symbols are very, like they're not able to be misconstrued is what I would say. That can also be really helpful in reaching populations who have limited English proficiency, right? Like I'm thinking about the symbol of boats and, you know, the big red X through making sure that you're washing your boat after getting out of the water, right? Like that's a symbol that is pretty communicative and it is super powerful. So I think that's a great idea. So thanks for sharing that as well. The other part of that, getting the message across, is also just being really aware of using plain language where you can. I know that's not always easy when we're talking about some very specific things, but thinking about how would I describe this process? How can I write about this process at a third grade or fourth grade reading level, which is typically what's suggested by plain language experts as well. When you are doing different measuring techniques, I think it's important to think about different texture or different contrast for measurements. So, you know, whether it is blackening a line or putting a tape by a particular measuring point, or even just a little bump that you can put in there, something that sort of indicates this is the measurement, or this is how much we're looking for, something along those lines that can also indicate more than just a line on a plastic container. Thinking about using actual large font ID tags. So if you know you do need to place something in a particular container, making sure that you know, maybe there's a little sign that there's a spot for Velcro and you're Velcroing on what sample is going in that container. It's large, plain font as well. So anything else that can sort of support that visual identity. I also think, like in practice, this is helpful for multiple people, not just those with low vision or some sort of vision loss. Is being very specific, giving very specific directions or location, versus a general like, oh, we're gonna go over there. Well, perhaps I didn't see that you were pointing to the right, or you know, over there doesn't necessarily mean anything to me, or even as you're walking to that location, talking about, okay, so we're walking north out of the parking lot here, and we're gonna take a hard left into the woods. There's going to be some stairs there. Again, that's not only helpful for folks with vision, but it is kind of prepping people for what's coming for mobility as well. And if you're keeping up with that too, if somebody gets separated, less likely to become lost or things of that nature. If you are out on the water or making your way to the water, you know, thinking about, is there a way that you can sort of flag an area that you want people to be in? Do you have some buoys that can signify an area that is being sampled from as well? So again, just anything else that sort of pops and can kind of draw focus to, as well as give information. And then I'm going to stop at this one for the interest of time, but also thinking about considerations for folks who are deaf or hard of hearing. If you are inside doing a training and it's possible, highly recommend, encourage to utilize a microphone. Depending on where you're completing trainings, that might not be available, but certainly hugely helpful as well. Sort of along those lines, if you're outside and it's possible to have smaller groups, that can be a really helpful way so that people aren't all spread out. I know that's a little weird right now with the pandemic and can be tricky, but also thinking that if people can be closer together, that proximity can help with some folks who are hard of hearing. Meeting under a shelter and going over the training or reviewing certain parts, there's just going to be some additional protection there, so words aren't going to be blasted out into the wind. And then two things that I wanted to share is the consideration of purchasing some assistive listening devices. One of the most common ones is the Phonak Roger pen, and it essentially looks like a pen that a speaker is wearing around their neck. And then the person who is deaf or hard of hearing, who may have hearing aids, is actually able to connect the frequency and be able to hear it that way. It can also amplify in some ways as well. The other thing I'm still learning about is the use of phone mics. So actually being able to take your smartphone, put a microphone into it, and using it for amplification. And I think that's for specific users. So those specific users might also need to have a phone or an iPad or some sort of device to be able to hear that. So I'm still learning about it, but also recognizing that can be a really great way to amplify when trainings are being done outside. So as I learn more, I'll share more. There is more information here, but this is the key stuff that I wanted to get through today, or at least, again, sort of toss out and hope that something sticks. So I will pause there and open it up for any questions, concerns, thoughts.
I think I managed to look up all your links and get them posted in the chat.
You.
And then Zach Stewart just posted something about American Canoe Association publishes essential eligibility criteria for participation in their adaptive paddling programs, which looks like a really good resource too. So he put the link in with that.
Yep, and I think this is really helpful as well, Zach, because it actually kind of goes over that essential eligibility criteria, right? Like folks do have to meet the essential requirements to be able to participate in any events as well. So it's a great resource, and it also ties in perfectly to, I think, some of the natural challenges of figuring out accessibility when there are in fact actual essential things, functions or eligibility that folks have to need to be able to do to participate. So that's great. Yeah, and Dara has a comment there. While she's not hard of hearing, still likes to not miss what a speaker is saying, right? So having mics and speakers are great for anyone with wind, vehicle noise, side discussions going on, things of that nature. Yeah, and I think that's the reality. Although I'm thinking about specific disability populations when I'm sharing some of this information, the reality is everybody benefits from it. Or I shouldn't say everybody. There's a good chunk of people who will benefit from it. I would say that absolutes are something that are I'm trying to be aware of, because not everybody is anything, so or aware of anything. So
yeah, it can be hard enough to hear people in a meeting room, let alone in a outdoor setting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and sometimes it's not even about the ability to hear. Sometimes it's about the ability to concentrate and focus. I'm definitely one of those people who, if I'm in a group setting and I'm having a conversation with one or two people, and there's two people to the right of me that are also having a conversation, I physically have to turn and block my ears so that I am still attending to the people that I want to attend to and getting that information.
Any other questions or comments, ideas? Is there anyone want to share something they could take away from this and think, oh yeah, I've seen that situation and I could do this adaptation or this other adaptation? And you can go ahead and unmute.
While folks are thinking, I will also just say if there is a specific accommodation needed, the Division of Extension does have a process for participants and volunteers to request accommodations. I think oftentimes it can be done informally and people feel relatively comfortable, but if there's a specific accommodation for having an ASL interpreter or captioning for an indoor event or training, please encourage folks to actually complete a disability accommodation request form. And
Is that something I could do for our partners?
Yeah, if extension is if extension is a partner, then it's my understanding that we can still provide and support those different accommodations as well. So yes, you can, or we might have, you know, you, Janine, share the actual link to participants who are requesting those accommodations. I'm also available just to talk through, explore different accommodation requests that might not necessarily be connected to communication access as well. Or if you're like, I think I can do this. Does this make sense? Is this reasonable? I'm happy to chat and connect as well.
That's great. And if do you mind go ahead, put your email address in the chat too, so people have it?
Yes, I can.
And Stephanie Bozeman, excellent presentation and a wealth of information that she's going to share with her department and utilize with the programs. And like I said, I'll get the PowerPoint switched into a PDF so I can put it in our box folder from the meeting so that you guys all have access to it there too. And I think you just got there. They're just thinking they're just going to have to go to lunch and mull everything over. So
always hard to be before lunch and after lunch.
Yeah,
you know?
I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.